Hello and welcome to the third of 5 webinars that have been developed by the Victorian Department of Education in collaboration with La Trobe University. These webinars complement a live workshop series that has been held across Victoria for most of 2008 for teachers, leadership and Triple S staff, and focused on learning difficulties including dyslexia. The agenda for the live workshops and this webinar series comes from recommendations of the Program for Students with Disabilities. This review was completed in 2015. So a series of 5 webinars are a follow-on opportunity to continue the discussion about how best to support students with learning difficulties, including dyslexia. And this current webinar examines the role of decodable books and contrasts these with predictable texts. As brief background, this is the team. Together we developed and presented all of the materials in the live workshops. My name is Dr. Tanya Seri. I'm a senior lecturer at La Trobe University. Again, many of you may have seen this slide, but it's always fair to say that some of what I say today and perhaps in other webinars may not sit that comfortably or be that palatable to some people. I welcome any comments and feedback offline, but I just think it's important to make this statement at the outset. The structure of the webinar, I will explain shortly. First, I wanted to alert you to 2 online polls that will be running during this webinar. To participate in the poll, you need to dial into the number on the screen, 0427 541 327, and when the poll is on the screen, it will give you the code to text. So you text the code into that number and it will appear on as part of the poll live. It's not compulsory to participate, and if you do so, it's completely anonymous. The poll is set up though that each person can only respond once, and once you've responded, you can't change your answer. But they're not serious questions. It's just gauging some information about the views on decodable books. This webinar will cover the following. We'll talk about the origins of the debate broadly called the reading wars, and part of that has been a debate around decodable versus predictable texts. We'll talk about the when, what, when and why of when to use decodable books and when they're not necessary. We'll look at decodable books and consider the value as a teaching tool, and we'll also look at predictable or repetitive books and consider the value of those as a teaching tool as well, and then we'll recap everything at the end. For the live workshops, these were key themes or terms that came up repeatedly. So for today, I'll be focusing drawing mainly on systematic synthetic phonics because it is closely aligned with decodable books, and the webinar today will provide a strong case for the role of decodable books as part of a teaching tool. We'll also be touching on these other topics as well because we are always focused on using the best available evidence for anything that we do. Oral language competency, which is so critical to learning to read. And again, what I say today is important for all students, not just those who have struggles with learning to read and become literate. Here's the first of 2 polls. It's just for your own reflections. My knowledge about the purpose of decodable books is. So if you think it's strong, you select that code 302732 and text it to that number. And similarly for the other 2 options. Otherwise, you can go to the website, thepollev.com, as you can see on the screen, and this screen will appear on your device and you can select your answer as well. So I'll just give people about 30 seconds to respond. Another 10 seconds on this poll. Okay, just concluding on the results that we've got on the screen at the moment. You can see we have a mix in our audience, so I'm really glad that you've all tuned in, whether you feel confident or you don't feel like you've got a lot of knowledge. Clearly there's a peak in the middle. It almost looks like a normal curve, but we certainly have a range, people with a range of different levels of knowledge or beliefs about their sense of decodable books. So thank you very much for participating. On the next slide is the second and last poll. We're still going on this one, but I'm going to take it off and move to the next screen. The process is exactly the same. At my school, and I know for some people you will have multiple schools that you service, so answer to the best of your ability if you are going to multiple schools. But at my school, beginning readers are provided with decodable books to take home and read. So there are 4 options there. Another 10 seconds on this screen before we move on. From this snapshot, and it is just a snapshot, there are clearly some variable practices that are going on in different schools based on these results. Seems to be a slight preference for using decodable books. So as my talk progresses, I feel quite happy with that. But again, some variable practices around the use of decodable books. So thank you very much, and I'll move on now. So we all know that reading is a really good thing, and there's heaps of choices about what we as adults can read, and certainly for what children can read for pleasure and also for learning to read and reinforcing what they're being taught in school. So there's some terms that I'm going to be using a lot today. We've got decodable books, predictable books, and authentic texts. So the question is, what's the choice? What should we be giving students to read? For pleasure, for learning, for all the sorts of things that we want students to become literate, first of all, and also to have a love of reading. And my argument is really that authentic texts, authentic literally being books that are read for enjoyment or for fact-finding, anything that's authentic, it's got some sort of narrative or non-fiction content, is going to be fantastic all of the time. And I will be putting a strong case for decodable books over predictable books when it comes to helping students reinforce and come to mastery with learning to read. So the argument really becomes about the pros and cons of decodable texts and predictable texts. We could all find strong cases for either side of the coin or either side of this seesaw. I'll be presenting to you both sides of the coin, but again, putting forward an argument for decodable texts based on theory rather than just a personal preference, of course. So let's now start delving into what a decodable and predictable texts look like and how they're so different. Just on this first screen, Pip and Pat versus I Like Apples. Pip and Pat fits into a decodable format, and I Like Apples fits into a predictable format. Of course, for young children's books, they would typically have pictures, but Pip and Pat, as you can see, is quite phonically controlled, whereas I Like Apples has much more, many more phonemes in it, different spelling patterns, and things that make it more complex. As background to the reading wars, we've talked quite a bit on Monday or the first webinar about the reading wars, but I just wanted to go into the background of that a little bit more because I refer to it myself as not just a reading war, but a battle of the moral high ground. So I'd just like to present a couple of things about where the origins were and perhaps how they came about. So this is a picture of me in the 80s, graduating from my first degree, and it's certainly not that I like to put those pictures up where I'm really trying to channel a very different hairstyle that's around today. But I wanted to put that up because I graduated from university in the mid-80s. I had the fortune, simply by chance, of going to school when there was no reading war, pre the reading wars. The reading wars really came about from a shift in pedagogy that was driven by a strong socio-political movement rather than a theoretical movement, and that really argued for a much more child-centred pedagogy, and that really began the whole process of different types of pedagogy, much more child-centred, much more about facilitating rather than teaching, and a whole host of things that many of you would be very familiar with. So really, I felt like I was very lucky, like the band Skyhooks, whom some of you may know, some of you may not, to grow up living in the 70s. They were the pinnacle of my school years. But unfortunately, when this socio-political movement came and said, hey, we need to really think about the way we are teaching children, we're far too directive with them, a lot of ego got in the way. And the second album by Skyhooks was called Ego Is Not a Dirty Word. And I guess my moral high ground is that unfortunately, a lot of ego got in the way and people just didn't sit down and talk about the differences and underpin their views based on a strong theoretical framework. So putting that aside, one of the key things about the reading wars is that meaning must dominate, that children shouldn't be drilled because it would kill the passion for learning to read. At the end of the day, no one would ever argue the importance of extracting meaning from what we read. That is the ultimate aim of reading anything. It's just that when we are learning to read, theoretically, we need to learn a lot of skills that lead us to becoming competent at comprehending. So that's really where the tension was in the reading wars, the tension about whether instruction targeting just the context of the text and just the meaning of the text was sufficient as a vehicle to equip young children to be competent readers, or whether we should actually still be teaching children the foundations, the building blocks, the phonics in a very systematic way. And my argument would be that we still do need to teach children those foundation skills to get to being able to extract meaning from text, which is ultimately what reading is all about. Some of you may have watched the phonics debate on YouTube. It was held on July the 31st. I strongly encourage you to, particularly if you are working in the younger years with students. It was a debate titled Phonics in Context, Enough or Not Enough? So really at the heart of what we're talking about in this webinar today. So let's target this argument and ideally try and avoid this argument with these three different types of books that I've talked about for young children. So decodable books I'm arguing for, but they can completely overlap and can be used alongside authentic texts. Decodable books are very useful for reinforcing phonics patterns that students are being taught in schools. Authentic books can be read to students at any time, at school, at home. Children can flick through books without maybe following the text. Authentic texts are like an always type of book. So there's decodable and authentic should never be seen as mutually exclusive, but I would argue that we need to take predictable texts out of the equation. And let me just explain to you why I'm saying that. So decodable books are an essential complement to any synthetic phonics instruction, and that's because decodable books align with the systematic nature of synthetic phonics instruction so that students read books based on the elements that they have been taught in a systematic synthetic phonics program. Authentic books, which could be akin to literature or perhaps non-fiction, but are absolutely essential for language growth, for content knowledge, and a whole lot more. There's a lot of bonding that goes on between parent and children during shared book reading. So authentic books are an always, and as I mentioned earlier, are certainly not mutually exclusive from decodable books. It's likely in the early years, though, that authentic books will either need to be read to children or that they can just spend time flicking through them, but they're not aiming to actually read all of the text while they're still learning how to read. Predictable books promote multi-cueing methods because, as the title says, they are predictable. We have to use multiple cues, such as these here, using prior knowledge, using the shape of the word, using picture or context cues, and perhaps other cues as well. So predictable books are used on the premise that students should be using multiple methods to try and work out what the word is, rather than using just the word elements, the intra-word elements, to work out what the word is. Instead, I'd like to propose another model. So we have a range of age children and teenagers from infancy right through to adolescence. And I would say that authentic books are from always. We are told from day one, and I fully reinforce this view, that we should be reading to our children when they first come home from hospital. Authentic books, of course, age appropriate, but authentic books can be used at all times. If parents are reading to children, many have the view that they should stop once the children become readers. And I would suggest, I wouldn't reinforce, but I would suggest that even when children are, say, 8, 9, 10, and are able to read even chapter books that are age appropriate, it's still really valuable to read to students. And that's why I put the arrow right across. The paler arrow for the teenagers, maybe because hopefully they're reading for pleasure as well. It might be too old for them to be sitting having a book read to them by parents, but who knows? But authentic books are absolutely for always. Decodable books are really valuable for a short period of time when children are learning how to break the code. And decodable books are designed, they're phonically controlled, designed specifically to help children master how to break the code for reading words. They don't have great value afterwards, but certainly for students who struggle to learn to read, decodable books are essential, because we do need to make sure that everyone can decode words. It's difficult finding appropriate resources for older struggling readers who need to go back to those basics, but fortunately there are many more book series coming onto the market for older student readers, older struggling readers, that are phonically controlled. And offline I can give you some resources if anybody is interested in that. So let's just think about what we actually mean by a decodable book. What does it look like? Essentially, these are books with simplified spelling patterns, which beginning readers can tackle independently and successfully, given that they have been taught those spelling patterns in class. They usually come in a series, and any series is systematically organised to gradually build up the number of sound spelling combinations that are contained in any book. If anyone is familiar with schemes such as Jolly Phonics or Little Learners Love Literacy or the Letters and Sounds program out of the UK, you'll know that there are a series that everything goes in levels, and we target the sounds in one level before we move to mastery. Before we move to the next level. Decodable books align with those levels, so that again students are not trying to read words they should not be able to tackle because they haven't been taught those letters. So using decodable books, it aligns very well with explicit teaching pedagogy, because we're not asking students to do anything that they haven't previously been taught. In this case, we're not asking them to read something that will be beyond them or that they don't have the skills and equipment to actually target. So as I've mentioned at a previous webinar, it doesn't leave reading to chance, and that was a statement from Troy Berry, who was one of the panel members in the phonics debate that I referred to. Using decodable readers does not leave reading to chance, because it builds solid foundations for word reading that are reinforced using decodable books. In decodable readers, there are a small number of high-frequency words that are irregular and do have more complex spellings, and they do get taught within decodable series. It's not that every single word has to be fully decodable. It is the case often that many of those what are called high-frequency words can be partially sounded out. But in any scheme that you use from a decodable reading scheme, there will be a small handful of words that just have to be taught so that the story can actually have some cohesion. But the basic framework is that students are taught the basic code progressively and systematically, so that they're taught about all the relationships between all initially single phoneme grapheme relationships, and then it becomes more extended as more complexity is built into the system, and that particularly is around the complex vowel system that English has. I'm going to show you on the next slide a visual of the scheme put out by Little Learners Love Literacy. I've said it in other forums. I'm not promoting any particular scheme, but I'm just presenting this as an example of how the stages or the levels might work. So in this scheme, stage 1 all targets just these 8 particular sounds. You can see that there are 2 vowels and 6 consonants, and from those we can build lots and lots of different words, particularly because we have vowels as well as consonants. And progressively they get more complex. By stage 5, we're starting to have double consonants introduced and also the plural S, so building some morphology into readings as well, and they would all be reflected in decodable books. And this is just to show you what stages 5, 6 and 7 look like as well. So it's really a case of start simple, a bottom-up approach, moving to much more complex word and word spelling patterns. Here's an example of a page from a stage 1 book, the first stage in Little Learners Love Literacy. So they are the sounds that are being targeted. So all of the words in the book will be a combination of those 8 sounds, apart from some of the heart words. They call them, instead of high frequency words, they've chosen the word heart words, and they're on this screen here, the with capital and lowercase, and you can see the other 2 as well. So it looks like that. This is a new scheme. It is beautifully coloured, but there are some free online resources that I'll share with you later on today as well if you aren't able to purchase a new scheme, because they can be quite costly. Here's another page from a decodable book at a very early level. Is Sam a mop? Is Sam a pan? And again, on the next page, you can see the text here. Again, very phonically controlled in terms of the letters that are making up the words on the page. Let's unpack what we've just saw. Is Sam a pip? The structure, what I call the phonotactic structure, is as follows on this screen. VC, CVC, V, and then CVC. So the most complex structure is CVC, so at a fairly simple level. And this is a level 1 book, and that's what it should be. Is Sam a pan? Exactly the same. So in the 1 book, we're not making it any more complex. And these are the letters that children are asked to segment, blend, and read those words. Now here's a book in the same scheme at stage 6. So a lot has happened. A lot's been worked to mastery from stage 1, and now we're at stage 6. In stage 6, the focus is on consonant digraphs. And just as background, by stage 5, all of the singletons, the single letters, have been worked on in this scheme, as well as consonant clusters, which have just been introduced in stage 5. For example, the b-l in black, or the per in pray. The QU was introduced in stage 4, and double consonants were introduced in stage 4. So because a decodable series of books aligns with systematic phonics, which teaches everything to mastery before you move on, we can assume knowledge at stages 5 and below at this stage 6 book. And when children are asked to read this book at stage 6, they will have actively been taught all about these digraphs and had lots of opportunities to practice and rehearse before they're asked to read this page, or this book. So let's have a look what's on this page. Here we've got some of the consonants that are being targeted in, the digraphs that are being targeted include, as well as the QU sound, which came in stage 4. We've also got clusters, which we know occurred in stage 5, and we've also got the double T, which we know was targeted in stage 4. So once again, you can see that if a child is progressing as expected, reading this will not tax them beyond what they've actually been taught and should know how to do. The rationale for decodable books is as follows. The books contain spellings that the students know. That brackets mostly refers to some of the high frequency words that sometimes just have to be taught because they're irregular, but on the whole, at least 90 to 95% of all of the spellings in a decodable book at the right level, students should know. So reading these books provides students with an opportunity for ongoing practice for what has been taught in class. And we know that we learn best when we tie what we're being taught now to what we've learned previously. So it links beautifully with how we process and learn new information across the spectrum. These books encourage segmenting and blending, the underpinnings of synthetic phonics, and there's no need for guessing because the students can segment and blend the very vast majority of the words in the book. Decodable books align with a systematic synthetic phonics instruction, and I've highlighted systematic because they align with the various levels which are systematic. And it also aligns with explicit instruction, as I mentioned earlier. It doesn't ask students to do anything before they've been taught, explicitly taught ideally. So decodable books also avoid the confusing but all too common situation of children being taught a as in cat, and we see many word dictionaries on the shelves of lots of bookshops, a for apple, b for bat, so as in cat in the classroom, but then the books they read might have words such as table. There is a letter A, but it's table, and then they might see want, and they might see all, and any. These are not uncommon words. In fact, they're highly likely to be in many books. So it's really confusing. And if we give students those sorts of books, they're going to be really forced to try and use multiple cues because it will be too hard for them to decode, particularly if they are at CVC stage at levels 1 or 2 of any particular scheme. Here's just a brief example from the Spellphabet website of the variations in the way that we say the A sound in a number of words. Cake, wave, snail, play, table, basin. Lots of complexity there around just that letter A, which can be articulated and spelt in a number of ways. An argument against decodable books, which I'd like to really pop on the head now, is the argument that in English we do have some words, actually quite a few words, that are spelt the same but are articulated differently and also have vastly different meanings. So the north winds made the tree blow over and the path winds around a lot. The argument against that, and I'm really just reflecting a very important comment that was made by Dr. Jennifer Buckingham in the phonics debate, is yes, there is some complexity there. You might hear a student reading, the north winds made the tree bend over, and realise that makes no sense at all. But instead of multiple choices for that word, it might be the north breeze, the north sea, all sorts of things, or a word with a W, because children might be encouraged to look at the first letter and guess. There's only 2 choices. So we go from what might be multiple choices and psycholinguistic guessing game, as said by Goodman, to just 2 choices. So, of course, once we have the picture, it's very easy to work out which one it is. But the argument that English has too many words that are spelt in the same way but articulated differently really can be knocked on the head by the fact that the choices are very minimal as opposed to being multiple cueing. Once again, I've just put that phonics debate slide just to remind you that it really is well worth watching. So as decodable books, the case for using these as an adjunct to systematic synthetic phonics is because of that light bulb notion that I have talked about before. Because using a whole systematic synthetic phonics approach, which includes decodable books, means that students are equipped to read words accurately, efficiently, fluently, and that ultimately leads to reading comprehension that's strong. It doesn't leave reading to chance because we are building those solid foundations. And as Catherine Snow said, attention to the small units in early reading instruction is helpful for all children, harmful for none, and absolutely crucial for some. Let's now spend a moment thinking about what is meant by predictable books or predictable texts. They're simply books that are given to many beginning readers for home practice that contain non-controlled spelling patterns. Because children may not be being taught in a systematic way about the relationship between lots of letters and sounds, the books that they take home reflect that lack of systematic controlled phonics control as well. Each page usually contains a sentence and a picture, and often there is a carrier phrase or the same sentence that frames each page with 1 or maybe 2 words that are different, and that is reflected in the new picture. So I just mocked up one myself based on something that I have seen in a book called I Think I Can. So here it is. I think I can. So the student probably starts to learn I think I can because it is repeated, but they're probably unlikely to know how to read skip unless they see that picture. Similarly, run. I think I can. So a fairly astute student will catch on to I think I can pretty quickly, but may not get run because it has a very different structure, spellings, constituents to skip, but they see the picture and they can read it. Run, I think I can. And same here, kick, I think I can. Again, kick looks quite different in its structure to skip and run, but we see the picture and then the student will be able to read the book. And that is an example of how a predictable text might actually look. If we just look at the components of it, we've got the carrier phrase in yellow. Let's look at the structure here. We've got skip, CCVC, so already in a fairly early reader, we've got a consonant cluster. Run, CVC, that's quite a nice simple structure, but the vowel is, there's a different vowel. And kick, CVC, so simple, fairly simple structure, but it does contain a digraph as well. So there's a lot of complexity there that ideally could be much more controlled if it was written in a decodable form. They're used a lot in schools, often for guided reading as well as take-home books. So for guided reading, the book is read and discussed together, and children are encouraged to use a variety of strategies to read the words. I've put read a little bit tongue-in-cheek in inverted commas because I would argue that real reading is decoding by using the intra-word elements, not by using multiple cues. I have to acknowledge, though, that guided reading does provide opportunities for phonics instruction, but it's unlikely to be systematic or explicit. It may be much more prompted by an error or a word that a student might struggle on. So children often read these books by guessing from the pictures, looking at the first letters and looking at other context cues, and it appears to be reading-like behaviour. But it's not until reading becomes harder when students are actually now asked to read to learn rather than learn to read. And this is when it can be a problem for some students. It's often only halfway through primary school when the texts do get more complex and the task demand increases that adults, maybe parents, maybe teachers, maybe both, notice that the student is actually really struggling because their decoding is not strong, because they haven't had that underpinning strong foundations provided to them. This is from a study that I completed with some colleagues where I interviewed a variety of teachers, and this comment has been put on the public record, so I'm not breaching any confidentiality, but speaking to a teacher who aligned with much more predictable texts, who said the following: "It's all about not just the reading, but really understanding, talking about the book, predicting what's going to happen, saying to them, well, have a look at the picture. What colour is that dog? Brown. Oh, brown." And that was the cue to help the student work out what the word BR, or the sequence BROWN, actually stood for. So there is a clear example of using multiple cueing rather than encouraging the student to dig deep in the word and look at its elements, segment them out and blend them back together. Here is the PM starters. This is just from their website, from their starters series. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things, just even about the titles. So in these two books, Me and We Go Out, they are high-frequency words, but Me and Go in particular are quite unusual in terms of simple phonic one-to-one correspondences. They're probably not the best words to be teaching children if we are going to take a synthetic phonics approach. So children will be taught to just, that's the word go, and learn it by rote. In the word skier, already a very early book has got a consonant cluster, and climbing, we have a consonant cluster in the CL and a digraph with a silent B, MB for the sound. So there's a lot of complexity. It's not phonically controlled. So students have to go to other cues to be able to work out what the words actually are. Here's a decodable book such as what you can see on the screen. There will be presents, there will be balloons. I'd like to unpack this in the same way that we unpacked the previous book about Sam. There will be presents. You can see that the phonotactic structure of those four words is complex, particularly presents, where we've got lots of consonant clusters appearing. There will be balloons. So let's just have a look more deeply what's there. First of all, here are all the sounds. We've got digraphs, we've got double L, we've got the oo sound in balloons. There's the carrier phrase that we spoke about, but we've got the digraph the. We've got the double L here, which is one sound. We've got the consonant clusters at the end of words, and we've got a vowel digraph here. So there's a lot of complexity compared to what we looked at earlier with the decodable book, which is just, we've stripped away all that complexity. And some people would say, but it's so boring. But children that have success in reading get a lot of pleasure from being successful, and it will propel them to being able to read much more authentic texts in time. So with that argument, which was the heart of that debate, phonics in context, why is it not enough? Well, those who argue that it is enough, such as Goodman's famous article, Reading is a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game, and they argue that what students need to learn is the skill in selecting the fewest and most productive cues necessary to produce guesses which are right the first time. This was written in 1989, but there are still plenty of people that would support that view. But there really becomes a problem when we're trying to look deeply into what the words are. And that problem is the fact that using guessing leaves a lot left to chance. And the aim for teaching children to read and become literate is leaving nothing to chance. And there's very good ways of actually doing that. In this slide here, I've taken a small section from a really good article called What Happened to the D Word, the D in this case being decodable. There's a lot on the screen, but I'll just break it down for you. But the author has selected a book from a level 3 in a predictable book scheme and level 3 in another decodable scheme. In this case, it's the Little Learners level. So in principle, they're both level 3, so you would think that they're pretty similar, but when we drill down, we actually see that they're quite different. The total number of words in the predictable book and the decodable book was identical, 65 words. So the total number of words that students were asked to read. But when we look at the numbers of different words, the predictable book had 18 and the decodable book had 28. So that really starts to bring into question the fact that decodable books don't facilitate learning about words and meaning. We've got another 10 additional words in the decodable book compared to the predictable book. If we look at the nouns, some of the key nouns in the predictable book were Harry, robot, mum, and box. So just while you're taking those words in, let's think about the complexity of those words. Two-syllable words. One of those words has a medial double consonant. We've got the X in box, which is a complex sound. It's the one sound in our language where two sounds are represented by one letter. But if we look across to the words, the nouns in the decodable book, we can see that they're largely CVC words, with a couple of exceptions. We've got one with the apostrophe S and the QU would have to be taught, but otherwise they are all CVC words with a short vowel. So simple, stripped back complexity. If we look at the verbs, we've got click, look, looking and comes. Once again, you can see for yourself much more complexity compared to hop, can, zim and zap. Arguably, zim is a made-up word, nonsense word, but it has been woven into the story to have meaning. But CVC structure with short vowels only, not the U in look, as in a vowel digraph. And same with the adjectives little and happy, 2 syllables, both have a double consonant in the middle compared to the CVC words. The interesting thing also, if we look at the high frequency words, the predictable book has 9 and the decodable book actually has more high frequency words, but the majority of the high frequency words in the decodable book are actually most of them are fairly decodable. You know, yes, not, can, on, and so forth. So many of those what are considered high frequency words would actually, the students would be encouraged to actually segment and blend them, to actually decode them based on what the constituents they're made up of. Spelled SA are one of the, we've got a series of spelled organisations around every state in Australia, but Spelled SA have a whole scheme of phonic books available for anyone to download and use. They go from quite very basic to very complex, and I put at the sort of close to the top end of their materials. So for you people who would like to start looking at phonics books or haven't got the funds to support phonics books, there is an enormous number of resources freely available online. You can see the graphics aren't quite as beautiful as some of the more commercial products, but this scheme follows the Jolly Phonics scheme in terms of the systematic nature, and there's, apart from the decodable books, there are lots of series of worksheets to go along with that as well. I also came across this online resource from auburn.edu where they have downloadable books in PowerPoint form. So I've just, again, selected one as an example that you can download in a PowerPoint form, print out and have for students to read decodable books. So this is Sam's trip to the dock. This is Sam, he has a bad itch, and you can read the rest yourself. But again, there's not too much complexity in there. Again, I'm not here to support particular schemes. I think I look for properties rather than programs, but this was put out by Spelled New South Wales, and they have listed some of the commonly used decodable sequences on the screen here for you to use. So in sum, the key points for this webinar are as follows. The decodable books complement a systematic synthetic phonics instruction approach. They don't work in isolation, nor does synthetic phonics instruction work as effectively if decodable books aren't a complement. So they are designed to complement each other. Decodable books align with explicit teaching. Explicit teaching as a general concept will be the topic of an upcoming webinar, but we know that for teaching students new information, explicit teaching is really the most powerful way to teach students about any piece of new knowledge or domain-specific knowledge. And because decodable books, the premise of them is to teach a small amount of information to mastery and then move on, decodable books align with systematic synthetic phonics instruction and hence decodable books as well. All children benefit from synthetic phonics and decodable books, not just for struggling readers, something that is held quite widely in some quarters. And finally, decodable books form a really important and strong safety net against guessing and predicting written words. That's the end of the webinar, so thank you very much for tuning in live, or if you've tuned in at a time that's not live. We are all contactable on our email. Some of us also dabble a bit with Twitter, some of us more than others, but we are welcome to receive any queries, probably mainly to me as the presenter today. I'll have greater context for what any particular queries are. But I thank you for your attention, and I hope you've learnt some more information about decodable books. Thank you.